Okay.
Okay. I mean, do you have any announcements you want to make first, Rob?
No, we're good to go.
Oh, okay. All right. So we're going to try the screen share thing, but so you most of you have probably already heard this, but let me just go back real quick. As far as my background, I've been behind the camera for 30 years, and while I'm certainly not as famous as some of our other people that are out there, I got lucky enough to turn a hobby into a career. Worked for McCormick Spice for a short time, worked for the Rouse Company, eventually landed at Mercy Medical Center downtown, where I was working in the marketing department for 26 years, doing photography, video, and really just kind of on the forefront of the whole multitasking thing of shooting video and stills at the same time. So how this trip came about, I was sitting in my office one day, and at this point I had heard that there were some colleagues, some nurses and some doctors going on these medical missions to Peru, which I didn't really know a whole lot about. But I was sitting in my office one day working on, at that time, the newsletter, and a nurse by the name of Gisela Alvarez, as we call her, G, who still works there, and she's still a friend of mine. She brought in this 4x6 picture of these kids from the Peru trip, with outstretched arms. They were coming home from school. So just kind of imagine that last day of school from around here, with kids sticking their faces and hands, and smiling out a school bus window. And that's basically what you had, except that they were actually just walking on a dirt street. I actually tried to get G to find that photo for me, but it goes back so far she couldn't dig it out. But while I was sitting there, looking at this photo, and I had asked her, going, where did this photo come from? And she started telling me that story. And I had asked her just point blank, has anybody ever documented this trip? And she said no. And I was like, what are the options? Is that possible? So the group never really thought about it. And that's really started the ball rolling, as far as getting me involved. And as I learned more about it, and kind of what Jerry was saying, as far as having to pay your own way, this was a $1,500 expenditure I would have had to have done out of my pocket. Well, I was just married at the time, young kids. It's just, the money simply wasn't there. So, and I said this to Gisela, and she came back to me and said, well, what if the hospital administration pays for it? And I was like, well, I'm not going to ask them. There's no way that's going to happen. Again, I'm just looking at it in a time this happened again. We're talking, early 2000s, and money just being money. I'm thinking to myself, okay, we can buy medical supplies for the people who need it, or they can send me to Peru on this mission trip. And I was like, no, I was not going to ask them to pay for it. Well, unbeknownst to me, somebody had already done that. And next thing you know, Pandora's box opened. So in preparation for this trip, this trip was at the base of the Andes Mountains, in the northern end of Peru. And you'll see in the pictures that you could get lost in this place. I could have disappeared off the face of the earth. But now all of a sudden, I've got to prepare not only for my first international trip, but my first professional kind of documentary trip. I was doing all kinds of stuff around the hospital, which was really cool, but that was a comfort zone. I knew the place inside and out. That was really not even a test for me at that point. So I had to start thinking about how I'm going to get my gear there. I was also responsible for carrying medical supplies. I was told that when we go through customs, it's possible my equipment could be confiscated. How am I going to lie my way through that? I better have money to bribe the guards at the at the depot, because it was easy to buy them off. I mean, I'm hearing all of these kind of stories going, why am I doing this? But, my goal as a kid and getting into photography, I really wanted to work for National Geographic. That was really my goal. I mean, my grandmother for years had given me a subscription to the magazine, talking about, I think it was, Lem, I think you talked about doing travel photography. I'm like, that's really what I wanted to do. I just didn't know how to do it. I mean, I went to school for photography. I went to community college, but I had no clue. And this is long before the internet, and the internet was really kind of in its infancy, so to speak. But the whole Facebook and Instagram, that stuff basically did not exist. So at this point, I'm making this travel list of batteries, the equipment that I have. At that point, I took, the only thing I had was a D100, and that was only a 6 megapixel camera. I had 2 lenses. I had no backup. So my backup was a point and shoot that I had literally sitting in my closet. I also took a Sony camcorder with me because I wanted to shoot some video. So literally, I'm traveling, several hundred, I think maybe even 1,000 miles. I don't even know what it is. I'd have to go back and look. But, if something went wrong, I was toast. I would not have been able to do my job. So all that planning I had to do up front. But then once I found out that, the administration was sponsoring me, then it became a job, because I kind of went into this in a very selfish standpoint of wanting to be that National Geographic photographer. And being a bit of a mama's boy, I wasn't really taking a whole lot of risk when I was a kid. So, the reality was that wasn't going to happen. But this was my chance. So I went into it very selfish to a degree, but came back with a whole different perspective of not only life, but how to shoot. And we'll talk about that a little bit. And, really how to approach photography. Because literally this was trial by fire. I had no backup. It was either do or die. So I'm going to try and do a little bit of screen sharing here. So I got a little PowerPoint thing we're going to work on here. So let's see. Can you guys see that or no?
No.
No, hang on a second. No, I did it in the wrong order. Sorry.
Now
okay, how about now?
Yep.
Okay. All right. So we're gonna do a little Indiana Jones here, one of my favorite all-time movies. So let's see. All right. So what do you guys see on your end? Are you seeing the presenter view, or are you actually seeing the regular view?
Regular view.
Okay, perfect. Because I lost you guys. So I know you can see me, so hopefully I don't look too much like an idiot.
No more than usual.
Yeah, I hear you. So anyway, so the group came from all over the country. So obviously, me being from Maryland, as well as a few of my colleagues, we eventually. Oh, sorry guys, I just messed that up. This is what happens when. There we go. So we all met in Miami, and there was about 14 of us. We went, and then we flew into Lima, and then eventually to Piura, and these are all plane rides. And they eventually went to Chulacanes. Now, Chulacanes is on the northern edge and at the base of the Andes Mountains. And in this particular region, they were already in desert mode. It was a drought. So 110 degrees during the day. It barely got into the 80s at night. There's no air conditioning. It was as wild and uncomfortable as you can get. So, okay. I just tried my space bar. Rob, you and I kind of tested this, and now it's kind of getting all goofy. All right. So, and just to give you a sense of, you can see Chulacanes, and so it, obviously is surrounded by, Ecuador, Colombia, Brazil, Bolivia. And the interesting thing about this region was, as remote as it was, in many respects, even though the pictures will tell you otherwise, they were in some ways ahead of the curve, and I'll tell you why in a minute. And it really just had to do with the internet, because there was no high speed, and they were just getting into phone. What was the phone when you did your internet through the phone? I forgot what it was called that fast.
Dial-up.
Yeah, dial-up. Thank you. So they had dial-up, and they were having these internet cafes pop up all over the place, almost like a Starbucks, which was really kind of interesting. But as we get into the pictures, this is the environment. So you can see me here with a couple of my colleagues. You can see as far as the eye can see. That is a horizon out there that I can't even tell you how far it is away. But if you look closely at the detail of the buildings, I mean, this is a jammed in city. The total population is about 250,000 people, but their healthcare, which is what we were there to provide, surgical healthcare, mind you, only comes once a year. And that's what this group is. The state or the country really doesn't provide anything. And if somebody needed to get some emergency healthcare that could not be provided in this area, they had a 2-hour ride of some sort. And the question is, what is that ride? Is it a motorcycle? Is it a car? Is it a bus jammed in with other people? And if you notice, I don't know if can you guys see my arrow moving?
Yes.
Okay. So if you look at this white dot right where my arrow is, that's the hospital. The hospital is about the size of 4 Wawas. That's it. And in there is everything, regular doctor's appointments, surgery, you name it. And what I pulled out just to save some time is that might be where the surgery is, but the recovery room was actually right about there. Once your surgery was done and you were awake and the docs and the nurses said, yeah, you can travel, you went to another place to recover. So I'm coming from a hospital at this point that's very modern, very sophisticated, and I'm looking at this going, this is insane. Here I am, I'm a small town boy from, Hartford County. I've never been very far outside of Hartford County other than visiting family in Florida. This is an environment that was warned to begin with to not be shocked by the poverty, which that really wasn't an issue for me. But all I could wonder was, how do these people survive? And they are truly survivors. And as I show you some of my photos, I probably have never been in a space that was more welcoming and more humbling than in this desolate area. And real quickly, just to introduce my colleagues real quick, to the far right is Sean. He was a PA. There's Gisela, my friend from Mercy, who is in the middle. And and that fast, I forgot. Yeah, I forgot her name. That really is bad. It'll come back to me because trust me. But anyway, we were on top of this local hill, and this was actually towards the end of the trip. But so let's get into the environment a little bit. And to me, this picture does speak volumes. If you take it just a few minutes and just look at the surroundings, the background is the Andes Mountains. These are 3 gentlemen who are basically construction workers. You can tell by the daylight, it's end of day. I'm in the back of a truck. We're actually heading back to our base camp, if you will. But if you just look at just how dry everything is, this is what they live in and day out. There's no running water. There's barely any shade. And if you're in trouble out here, you're in trouble. End of story. So, at this point, I am out of communication with everybody. Of course, I'm with my team, and again, being new to international travel, the naivety of this experience was to my advantage. If I had thought about this ahead of time, I probably may not have gone. Because after we were there for a few days, we actually had the local police come up and give me and the group a warning, because there was a crime gang in the area. Well, they saw I had camera equipment, so I wasn't really allowed to travel very far without escorts of some sort. And most of the time I stayed with the team anyway, because that's really what I was there for. But in this particular shot, where we're coming from is part of the outreach that the group was doing. They were building a 1-room schoolhouse. I'm not going to show you any of those photos. But we spent about 3 days out in this more remote region, literally building this 1-room schoolhouse. And you would have thought that we were building, the best place in the whole wide world for them. So But going forward, you know, the space where the horse and the gentleman who's collecting firewood is, you might say he's coming up the road. Well, in actuality, he's actually riding in what was an aquifer. Because what would happen during the rainy seasons, which have not at that point in time had not occurred for probably about 5 years at that point. And I don't know if things have changed for them, but the water would run off the mountain and through these aquifers, these channels. And that is how they would collect their water and store it in their huts. The nearest water at this point is miles away at a well. So, you know, they would literally take buckets. You know, this gentleman just happened to have wood, and that's how they cooked. That's how they kept their, you know, places warm at night during the winter. So, you know, they were truly scavengers in a lot of respects, in that it was all about survival. And you would come across these people, and they'd smile and wave, you know, like they didn't have a care in the world. So, you know, again, so I'm coming from this modern environment where we basically have wealth to some varying degree, you know, roof over the head, you know, running water. And, you know, here's a gentleman who was coming up the path just with some firewood because that's what he needed. But what I really like about this photo is the tree. And I'll give you a little sneak here, in that if you notice on the kind of the upper right-hand quadrant, I purposefully left it there. There's a dust dot. You can see that little kind of shadowy circle, you know, up there.
Yep.
And, you know, and again, we talk about changing lenses in these environments. Well, again, just a reminder, I got one camera. So I have no choice but to change. And it really doesn't matter how, you know, how cautious you are. These things are going to happen. And I purposefully left it there just to kind of bring it up and go, you know, it was really dusty. And, you know, that was a danger. And with that equipment, when I came back, I actually sent it all out to get cleaned. I didn't really have much of a choice. But the tree is really what makes this photo work for me, and just how it frames everything. So this was actually one of the few times, this was actually towards the end of our trip. I was actually out with a gentleman. I think his name was like Mucho or Macho or something like that. Nicest guy in the world. Didn't speak any English, but, you know, I didn't speak any Spanish, but he knew what I wanted. So we were kind of driving around. It was my only day that I was not locked in with the team. We kind of went outside the city just a little bit, and here is this woman washing dishes, this gentleman reading the paper. And again, just look at the bricks, the textures, you know, the blue, you know, drape that's covering up a window. And these folks are sitting up on a hill, and look at the steps to nowhere. What you don't see is the mountain that those steps end at. There's probably about a 50-foot drop at the end of those steps. And while I could have shot it that way, I was really, it was the juxtaposition of all the textures that really kind of caught me in this situation. And, you know, I got to thinking to myself, how do they get down? Now, I'm assuming they probably have a back stair somewhere, but, you know, but again, this hut was sitting on top of this hill. And if I had to guess, you know, wrong time of year, an earthquake, or, you know, some type of heavy rain, it really looked like this place would just slide off the hill. But this gentleman, he actually waved to me. You know, he saw me taking their picture. He thought it was cool. The one thing about these folks is they feel forgotten. You know, the state has completely kind of cast them aside as almost inhuman, you know, to a large degree. So anytime somebody can tell their story outside of their community, they feel like there's hope. And that was one of the things I actually brought home with this trip. So, you know, and we're going to get into the healthcare part of it in just a minute, but I really just wanted to kind of set up the environment here. And I don't know how well you can see it on your screen, but I want you to, if you can, try and pay close look at the dog. He's severely malnourished. And think about, and this, and I don't say this in a joking term, so to speak, but I call this drive-by shooting, because again, I was in the back of a truck. We were actually going somewhere, and the woman's got a pail of water. I did not have my long lens on. I didn't have a choice here. We're going, you know, up the street a little bit at about 30 miles an hour, sitting in the back of a truck. And I saw this woman walking with her pail. She's got something over her head to protect her from the heat. And the dog, you know, it's just, and again, looking at this bombed out look. And I was just like, good heavens. I mean, I don't want to get too philosophical here, but I'm thinking to myself very early on, I've got nothing to complain about.
Yeah.
But again, what I'm finding is just how welcoming when I meet these people. I never met this woman, and again, I shot these all originally in color, and some of it converted to black and white. But again, it's the textures and the woman carrying a pail. And if I had to guess, this woman was probably no more than, at that time, probably about 40 or 50 years old. But if you saw her, she looked like she was about 70. It's just the hard life, you know, that these folks live. So let's get into the healthcare a little bit. And I bring this up because this is this is patient information. So just to kind of give you an idea of some of the people you're going to see in just a moment, I want you to focus on that bottom line. 8 hours by car, 4 hours by car, 2 hours of walking. That's how a person I'm going to introduce you to shortly, that's what it took for that individual to get to the hospital one way.
Oh my God.
And, you know, I look at, you know, and again, and still when I see this, I go, holy smoke. And really, while the city itself has certainly improved, the environment really hasn't changed that much, you know, because again, they don't have cars, you know, they have bicycles, they have motorcycles, they have, you know, three-wheel kind of taxi situations. But I brought this in just so you guys understand that these are not necessarily local people. So the little boy on the middle, his name is Esney, and this is his grandmother. And again, my friend Gisela on the left. That blue card that you just saw was for that little boy. Now, at that point, he was probably, I'm guessing, probably 4 years old, maybe, you know, so he's probably he's in his teens now. Hopefully he's still alive. But this poor little kid had a hernia. Now, I mean, how many little ones do you hear about having hernias? So this grandmother literally carried him rather, in a sense, on her back out of the mountains into a vehicle for 8 hours, then into a car, and then walked. And that was one way. And what I didn't mention yet was that when it came to the trips, because of how the system worked, to guarantee that these people would show up, they would have to scrape every nickel they could to buy a portion of the medical supplies. So if it was stitches, for example, or gauze bandages, they had to bring some of their supplies with them. You would have thought that this grandmother had won the lottery to get her grandson, you know, health care. And while this is really nothing more than a snapshot, it was really just one of those situations where when you start talking to people, and you start hearing their backstories, you just kind of go, wow, you know, that's incredible that the endurance that this woman had to get her son out of the mountains and do all the traveling that she had to do to get her son health care that would not be available for another year if she didn't do it then. Because when it came to the medical missions, primary care, while there was a primary care mission, and I'm going to back up here a little bit, what typically happened with this medical group, with this particular mission, there would be a primary care mission in the summer. And then there would be a surgical trip in the fall. So keeping in mind, you're in South America, you're below the equator. So their summers are our winters. I think I have that right, and kind of vice versa. So, you know, we're going down there just around Thanksgiving. You know, this was just before Thanksgiving when this trip occurred, and it's blazing hot. But that's how they qualified patients to have surgery. And while the team actually worked, you know, about 8 to 10 hours a day, and then they, you know, blew off some steam at a local watering hole. I mean, they had beer. I mean, again, it was as basic as it comes. You know, I'm working about 20-hour days, because not only am I shooting this, then I'm going back to our base camp. I'm editing photos, and I'm creating a PowerPoint presentation that I'm uploading 2 o'clock in the morning. And interestingly enough, if you look at the time zone, we're actually in the same line as Peru. So the good news was, it wasn't like where I was talking about, you know, the speaker coming from France. Our time zones were the same, but I still had to upload at 2 o'clock in the morning, because that's when everything was quiet, because I was uploading on a dial-up. Now, amazingly enough, their dial-ups were very fast, because they had no infrastructure to circumvent. It was straight up, end of story. So it was actually pretty easy for me to get into my network back at the hospital, because what I was doing every day in the end was putting like a 10 slideshow story together, and I was writing captions, and then my boss was uploading that to what was then the intranet, the internal system for employees to look at. So that was another dynamic that came to, you know, from a sponsorship standpoint. Well, this is no longer just, hey, I get to go on a free trip and take pictures. No, I set my own objective for this. Nobody else did, but there was quite a bit of pressure to develop content every day while we were there. So I'm averaging like 4 hours of sleep, if I'm lucky, you know, through this whole process. This to me is probably one of the most iconic photos of the trip. There's 2, and there'll be another one coming up shortly. This was kind of early on in the trip, and I don't know this woman's name, but she was rushed into the OR. She went into premature labor. If I had to guess at that time, she was probably about 4 to 5 months pregnant, which it's a dangerous situation. Here, you go to the NICU, and, you know, your odds of survival are greatly improved. The real question is whether they didn't even know that if the child was going to survive this situation, which is unbelievable. So this woman is rolled in, and again, as luck would have it, I just happened to be in the right corner. I had the right lens. Of course, you know, and obviously we're in a tight space. I already switched my lenses, knowing that I need to go wide and somehow physically get close. And, you know, my operating room experience and medical experience, you know, I know my boundaries. So I'm able to kind of predetermine situations that I can handle. So all of a sudden, you know, I'm in the OR waiting for really the next hernia case, if you will. The door busts open, and I'm going, what's going on? I'm talking to the nurses, my colleagues, going, this woman went into premature labor, and it's an emergency C-section. Like, holy cow. So I jump into a corner, and I'm like, that's it. I'm just out of the way. Well, this is where a little luck and, you know, and knowledge pays off. I was in the corner towards the head end, as you can tell. The gentleman, the surgeon, his name is Hector Terraza. He was the medical director for the trip, and he is now retired, but he was a gynecologic oncologist. And so a very experienced GYN surgeon. And they're talking Spanish, so I have no idea what they're talking about. And I'm just shooting and shooting and shooting, looking for that moment. And you look at the hands, you know, you look at the eye contact between the two. Again, I shot this in black and color, turned it to black and white. I just thought it was just a lot more dynamic in that black and white. And I think my ISO on this one was probably 1600. Again, thinking about, this is a 6 megapixel camera. If it was more than 1600, that would just be stupid, because the noise would just be outrageous. But it was probably 800 or 1600. No flash. Again, minimal lighting in the OR, so it's not like it's very bright to begin with. So while the anesthesiologist from our team is giving her, the epidural, he is just there comforting her, telling her it'll be all right and whatnot. And it was just as chaotic as the scene was. I shouldn't say chaotic. That's probably the wrong word. The urgency of the situation, as it was peaceful. It was quiet. It was methodical. Hector's talking to the patient, and fortunately, I think about 10 minutes later, baby boy was born. They wasted no time. And, the baby was healthy. What happened to the baby after that, I'm not really sure, but the surgery was successful. That was the most important part. And then obviously they had to deal with, other medical issues to making sure that, the baby was safe and whatnot. But, again, if that is one of two pictures that I come back from this trip saying that is it. But let's talk about babies again. And so this was another situation where I learned something about myself. So I'm hanging out in the hallway, and if you look really close, the lady in the background, she's got her hand over her mouth. The gentleman in the plaid shirt on the left holding the IV bottle, I'm hanging out in the hallway, and he taps me on the shoulder. Again, remember, I don't speak Spanish and they don't speak English. So he taps me on the shoulder and he kind of gives me that, hold on a second. So I'm like, okay, I have no idea what's going on. So about 2 or 3 minutes later, here comes this orderly holding this baby. The gentleman is holding the IV bottle. They're racing out to an ambulance, or their version of it, which was basically a pickup truck with a cap on top and a flashing light. It wasn't much of one. They did have an incubator of some sort in the truck. This child was obviously in crisis, and they had to get this child to a more advanced hospital in that region. They're passing by. I'm not going to say that this child had already passed away, but it was one of those situations where the child's eyes were glass, and I'm going, I'm just thinking to myself, how is this child going to survive in all of this heat? There's no air conditioning in the back of this vehicle, and I already know they've got about 90 minutes to 2 hours just to get to the nearest hospital. But the beauty of the whole thing was the fact that they didn't give up. And I only hope in the end that, this child did survive. But I look at, this, and it's a girl, by the way, I can tell you it's a girl, but you just kind of look at that dangling leg, with the sock on it. There's not a lot of life here. But it was fast. They came kind of racing through, and they waste no time, taking off. So again, this was one of those situations where I had about 3 seconds to grab a couple of photos, and boom, they were gone. But in the meantime, while I'm kind of waiting for this to happen, I see this woman out front, and you can see she's incredibly emotional. Well, come to find out, this was her grandchild. And in their culture, and it's not to judge anybody, but the whole male dominance thing in this culture, they're there to breed, and the women take care of the kids. The men go out and work in the fields. That's it. So I'm like, okay, but what I learned about myself in this particular situation, really never being in what I would consider a crisis, and for this woman, this is total crisis. As you can tell, I'm standing probably about 10 feet from her, and I am capturing her emotion. I am just firing and firing and firing my camera. And what I realized was everybody around me was looking at me like I was some kind of crazy person. How rude was I to take this woman's photo in this situation? Now, they didn't mug me or anything like that, but when when you make eye contact with somebody, you can read their eyes, whether it's a good or a bad situation. And it was probably the first time I've really ever felt uncomfortable taking a photograph, or actually post taking a photograph. Eventually this woman got into the ambulance and went with the child. But you can see the fear in this woman's eyes. And that's really what, and then, and unfortunately for her, the crying got worse. I did not capture that moment because I got to a point where it's like, okay, I probably overstepped my bounds here a little bit. I got my 2 shots. I stepped back. I probably could have got even more emotional images from her, but I made the conscious point of kind of stepping back. But again, it was one of those situations where it's like, oh, okay, I really felt uncomfortable. Now, I don't really feel that way anymore. And obviously, when it comes to crisis situations and being a working photographer, I now understand how to manage that. And that's something that I professionally developed over the years. But again, this is the first time I've ever been put into this situation. So all I'm really doing at this point is just being totally reactive, and kind of going with my guts, if you will. So we're going to jump ahead a little bit. And again, this is my buddy Gisela. And one of the things that this trip, this crew, as goal was to also buy supplies to feed the hungry that were there. And quite frankly, everybody's hungry. But what we would do is go to market, and they would buy bulk supplies, and part of kind of the mission. And Jerry, I'd be curious to hear about how some of your trips work, but on this particular one, part of our responsibility was to be an economic driver. Not much of one, but we helped financially who we could. So we would go to market, and we all had to, and part of that $1,500 in fee did not include, I was told to bring about $250 to $300 with me because I was expected to spend money there. And I really needed to anyway for bottled water and things like that, the commercial products that were safe to consume. But what we would also do is go buy food. And in this particular case, we bought a bunch of food. We went to somebody's house, and it was all bulk. We measured it out, and then we distributed it. So if you notice in the background, there's some sunlight coming through. This particular house had half a roof, and the floor you see is actually dirt. There's not much here other than a couple of tables, and some chairs, and this was their kitchen sink. Depending on who you talk to, a lot of people tell me this is the best photo, but I'm not looking at it from an art standpoint. Though I'll tell you, it's one of the more unique ones, that's for sure. But again, I'm in the back in the quote unquote kitchen area. And obviously, like many of us, and we let the dishes get piled up every once in a while. But there's this cat hopped up, and I was just watching the cat. And one of the things that I brought back from this trip is patience. I saw this cat, and he was kind of up there, kind of snooping, kind of sniffing for food. What can it lick? The usual stuff. I just stood there and waited, and I kept my camera up to my eye, waiting for it to turn and look at me. And that's one shot. I think I got maybe 2 or 3 because again, I had my camera on. I think the most it would do was like 4 frames a second, so it wasn't incredibly fast. But I got a series of images, and then the click click from the camera spooked the cat, and it took off. But again, this was one of those pictures where I've showed it to many people, and they go, "Oh my gosh, look at the cat." And I go, okay, so this was kind of more on the art side of things, I guess. But I also want to call your attention just to the sink itself. It's made out of cement.
Yeah.
Everything was made out of cement or wood. There wasn't the Formica countertops and anything like that. And I'll also say, look at the spigot. It's either on or it's off. Now, the water in this town only ran for, I think it was between like 6 in the morning and 11 in the morning. The state shut off the water. So from a crew standpoint, we had to be up early. We were limited, at our base camp. And I say camp, it was actually a building. It was actually, this is a Catholic, medical mission. So we stayed at the bishop's house. But, there were 14 of us. You had 5 minutes to take a shower because the reservoirs in these buildings, only held so much. So, and it was a cold shower. It wasn't a warm one. So you had to get in and get out. So you had to be very sparing with your water. It's the same situation here. You know, you can see up there a tooth, looks like some toothpaste, a toothbrush, some used plastic cups. So there's no place for these people to go to buy new stuff. They're constantly using things, you know, over and over again. So, you know, again, being, you know, I guess the real takeaway from this particular photo for me is just being patient and watching and not being in a rush. Because if I was in a rush and just snapped and go, okay, I got it, I probably would have not gotten this particular photo with the cat looking at me. So something to think about as you're out shooting. So, you know, one of the things that happened with this trip is it all became about the people. And as I told you before, I mean, I kind of went into this almost nervously selfish in that I wanted to do this whole kind of National Geographic thing. I really wanted to kind of get out there in the world, so to speak. But when I started seeing the faces, I got drawn into them. And this is actually at the school that, you know, my team helped build. And, you know, they're guys climbing up bamboo poles or ladders and whatnot, and they're making cement inside old olive oil cans. This little boy, there's no construction helmets, there's no construction shoes. These are guys wearing sandals, you know. I mean, the word OSHA doesn't exist here. But this little boy literally walked in and he stood right there. And again, I was just kind of waiting and looking. If you notice, there's a little bit of catch light in his eyes. I took my flash with me. You know, I kept it in my pocket. You know, knowing that you got high sun, high contrast. I put it on, knowing that I was going to need it, and boom, just like that, he showed up. And it was a situation where I turned and fired. He stood there for a couple more minutes, and I took a few more, but he wasn't going to be there very long because, again, you've got all these bricks being pushed up ladders on each side of him. You know, he kind of snuck in there. I'm sure the adults that were there, especially my team, they didn't want him there because if he would have gotten hurt, you know, it would not have been good if a brick fell on his head. So, but again, it's, you know, the faces and the eyes, you know, they can really tell stories if you kind of get drawn into it a little bit. So these two photos here, you know, I am not someone who typically names their pictures or titles them. It's not something I ever really gotten into. Hang on one second, I'm getting a little dry here. But the lad on the left, the young boy, you know, I called him Mowgli. You know, he was just kind of sitting there watching the adults build this school. And he was as still can be. He was mesmerized by everything that was going on. And I got to believe that it's probably something he probably doesn't see very much of. And one of the things that I learned about photographing some of these kids, especially early on, having the small LED or LCD screen on the back, I'm not really sure if these kids know what they themselves look like. Because there was a group of little girls that I had shot early on in the trip. I don't have it in this presentation, but it was one of our first kind of out and about visits, if you will, just checking on people. And I assume they were sisters because they were kind of hugging each other. But when I showed it to them, their reaction was priceless because I'm not sure if they ever really saw them for themselves. They were kind of perplexed, almost like looking in the mirror going, is that me? So that was one of the interesting kind of things in taking photographs of these people, and that lots of times they never see themselves. So again, you know, Mowgli's just sitting there. The gentleman on the right, this was towards the end of our trip. And what fascinated me with him was that one sandal just kind of sitting there. This was at actually what amounts to a reservoir. It was just a big well, and it was a man-made well, mind you. It was a brick square. I don't have the picture here, but he's actually a pump operator. So inside of this room that you're seeing is a big diesel engine that's pumping water out of a well, and it's being pumped into the reservoir. Now, on this particular day, the reservoir was being filled as a thank you for the team so they could go swimming. Because this particular well was, or the reservoir was only 4 foot deep. And let me tell you, that water was ice cold, but when you're on a 110-degree day, it felt pretty good. But, you know, I was kind of just watching him, and he was just kind of sitting there, and I looked at the textures of the brick, that chiseled face. Ironically, look at his watch. You know, I never got up close to him, but, you know, I'm sure it's not like a Rolex or something. But, you know, the fact that he's got this kind of silver watch on, I don't know, does that mean he's kind of wealthier than the other guy? Does he get paid better because he's the pump operator? I have no idea. But everything about that picture, between the textures, his chiseled look, the sandal sitting on the bottom, it just made for a portrait. And he never smiled. I mean, matter of fact, I thought he was kind of mad that I took his picture. But, you know, again, the faces that you run into as we were out and about. So, and so here's another gentleman. This is actually at the recovery area for surgery. Now, I think he was actually there for another medical appointment. This was not somebody in our group. But I'm walking inside this compound, and if I had to guess, if you can just picture, you know, any, you know, baseball diamond, if you will, that's surrounded by a fence, you know, in this case, they're brick walls, and you have to be let in. I mean, and when I say a compound, I mean it's a secured compound. This gentleman was just kind of sitting there, just kind of waiting his turn, and I'm kind of walking around, and I saw him sitting there, and again, I just kind of pointed to my camera, basically saying, "Can I take your picture?" And he gave me a head nod, and that's it. It was really quite that simple. I waved hi, I smiled, said thank you. He waved back, and I was gone. But this man was truly sitting by himself. There probably wasn't anyone within 300 feet of him. And from what I could tell, there really wasn't anybody inside the building. And I don't remember when I took the picture, but if you notice, there's some, you know, times on the wall, like office times. I'm betting I probably took this late in the afternoon because, again, what we wound up doing as a crew after the surgery day was over would always go to the recovery area, and the medical team would check on the patient. So where they go, I go. And, you know, this is kind of what in part was a result of that. Now, you probably saw this on the meetup. And again, like I said, I very rarely title my pictures, but I called this little girl Ballerina. You know, she was the sweetest thing in the world. Now, this actually is right outside the hospital where we were at, and literally across the street. And I'm actually just kind of sitting outside on the curb, mind you, just kind of drinking some water and waiting for the crew to come out. And again, you can tell by the sunlight, it's basically about late afternoon. She's just out there dancing on her porch with no care in the world. And so I'm looking at this little girl in her little red and white polka dotted dress. She's got this beautiful smile. There's no music. She's just dancing. Whatever is running in her head clearly is making her smile, and it's making her happy. And I looked at the trees, and it just kind of framed her up. And I just took a whole series of pictures. They're probably, not probably, I know I have some better dance pictures, so to speak. It was her facial expression that got me here. And it was probably one of the few that I really got spot on, where she was smiling more towards me versus head angles and whatnot. But she was as sweet as can be. And again, you know, we probably heard this many times before, but I don't care if it's in Peru or here, kids are kids. They just don't know any different than what's happening in the outside world. Because there's very limited internet. You had to go to the internet cafe. You know, there were cell phones. You know, we actually bought disposable phones to communicate with each other. So there were cell towers, but it's not like even people had, you know, a landline hooked up to their house. Most of them did not. So again, that's like I said, that's my Ballerina. And I actually had that up, hanging up on my wall in my house for a while. So again, this was kind of, we're riding in the truck. And there was this gentleman, again, he's kind of by himself. And this is actually, believe it or not, a quiet area. It's eerily quiet. And as I say, you know, when, you know, if something were to happen to you, I'm not sure if anybody would find you. But here's this man. I mean, I don't know what he's carrying. I guess it could be everything from food to laundry. But what I found interesting about this picture, besides him walking by himself, was actually the billboard. This is actually an election billboard. And a lot of the people in this town are illiterate, but they know how to count. I don't know exactly what this sign said, but I was given the details, and that this person was running for office, but a number was assigned to him as well. But if you notice, the 5 is X'd out. Well, clearly this was their version of a I guess a hate ad. You know, the whole, like what we see in our country. You know, there's always kind of advertising against the next candidate. Well, that's kind of how they do it. Now, I don't know how long ago the election was, because obviously this billboard has, you know, this has been painted up there on a stone wall for a while. But, you know, again, I just kind of looked at it going, okay, the only way these people knew how to vote was by number and what they heard about that person. So whoever put this billboard up said, don't vote for number 5. This, you know, I can't even say it. I'm not even going to try to. But again, if the person wasn't walking by, then that billboard does nothing for me. But again, it's just the loneliness of somebody walking by themselves, and then you throw the election billboard behind him. You just go, just, again, to me, that was just kind of interesting. So now we're actually going to jump actually to the very beginning of the trip, believe it or not. Now you would think you know, I kind of bounce around a little bit. Sometimes I do chronological order, but this was actually one of the very first pictures that I took. And this was one of the nurses actually worked in the Chulacanas Hospital, hugging Hector Terraza, who was our medical director. And, you know, this is an annual trip for him and the medical crew, but the medical crew changes every year. I mean, some people do repeat, but you would have thought this was the high school reunion, you know, 30 years in the making. The whole notion of being welcomed as a total, I'm a total stranger at this point. A lot of them think that I'm part of the medical team. I eventually developed the nickname Photo, F-O-T-O, because that's how people knew me. You know, they knew me as the camera guy. So if somebody was trying to get my attention that didn't speak English, they would go, photo, photo, and I go, hi, you know, and if they would wave to me or, you know, tell me to come here or something like that, that was the only form of actual verbal communication I had with a lot of these people, because they knew me as Photo, as in photographer. But, you know, being welcome to this environment was immediately humbling, going, holy cow, there's something bigger here than I even realized. And we had literally just walked in the door. And then you can see to the right, that's Joanne. They had actually gotten to the hospital ahead of us. Some of the nurses did. They went in to check on patients and whatnot. And Joanne actually speaks Spanish. So she had the benefit of being able to kind of roll right in. But, you know, again, just the hug and the emotion of having this group there. We were superstars. I mean, pick your favorite movie star, your favorite music star. To them, we were the equivalent to that. And that was probably the one thing that I really wasn't ready for. And just, and being in that position, it kind of changed the responsibility that I had in working this trip. So now we're going to jump to the very end. And this is virtually the very last photo that I took. This was the end of surgery day. We were still there for another 24, 48 hours to clean some things up. But this is the second of what I'm calling the iconic photos of the trip. I'm coming out of the OR. The last case is done. I walk around the corner and there she is, just like that. I didn't have time to do anything. I just point and shot. And I truthfully, I prayed a little bit going, did I get it? Because as soon as that flash went off, she went, no. And I went, yeah. But she gave me this big smile with her eyes. And, you know, she felt a little embarrassed, but this sums up the trip. You know, the long days, the long nights, the effort that it took to give people health care that if they didn't get it, the surgery that they needed, if they didn't get it within the 10 days that we were there, they were going to wait another year. And this was a local nurse, by the way. She's not part of the medical team. She was a local nurse. So, you know, again, it's being ready. You know, I never turned my camera off. I never turned my flash off unless it was literally off my camera. You just had to be ready. And I didn't make a lot of noise. You know, like I said, I was turning the corner and there I saw her, and boom, like I said, I picked up my camera, you know, I changed my focal point just a little bit, and boom, and that's it. And that's kind of where the presentation ends as far as the actual trip itself. I've been very fortunate on this trip. And again, this is some of the outcomes of this that, again, I was not expecting. This was nothing, you know, this was just me trying to tell a story. Well, look what happened. The son heard about it, Gisella's efforts, and that became a section cover. That actually happened after the business album, but my boss, who was the head of media relations, he's still there actually, you know, we're kind of looking at all of this and going, you know what, we could submit this for publication. And you can see some of the photos that I showed you are here. The only one that I haven't shown you, or actually, well, obviously the one with Gisella, you know, at the Sun, that was actually one of the few photos I actually got of her working, because that woman never stopped. Half the time I couldn't find her, because if she wasn't at the recovery area, she was somewhere like picking up food or something. You know, she wasn't really in the hospital very much. You had Hector, who was the medical director, and then you had Gisella being a nurse. She was kind of the logistics coordinator. This was one of the few times I actually saw her sitting down. This was a post trip. This was actually after the last shot I showed you of the nurse kind of bent over on the table. This was inventory time. What were the medical supplies that were left that we could leave behind for any potential surgeries? Because if they got a surgeon that happened to come into town, they needed to know what they had to work with. And if you look at the daily record side, the one photo that was not in the presentation is kind of to the far right, you know, 2 up from the bottom. Woman's opening a door and a woman is carrying her child in. The hospital went on strike. They shut the hospital down. And there was real concern, and because this happened once before, a couple of years prior, where they literally had to move the entire medical mission to a completely separate building about 10 miles away, because the medical staff at that hospital was in a fight with the country, with the medical service for the country. They were basically like no different than this country. You know, they were fighting for higher wages and better working conditions. So they had literally shut the hospital down for 24 hours. And we were just kind of sitting and waiting to see what was going to happen. And fortunately, we were allowed to continue working, but it was very, very difficult for that 24 hours. Because again, we did not know where we were going, you know, at that point. And then just lastly, just a nod to my crew. You know, this is the group that went. You can see me obviously on the far right-hand side, a lot thinner than I am today. But, you know, we had people from Florida, Missouri, trying to think where else they were from. The woman in the center wearing the kind of the green and the yellow, she's actually a nun. She's a Franciscan nun who is actually living in Peru. She was part of our kind of logistics team and helping us out. But we had a wide range of people. You had me taking pictures. You had nurses. If you see the lady in the back row wearing the red shirt, that's Kay. She was an IT person. This trip that we were on, they were starting to implement digital medical records. So they took a laptop and they started using Excel spreadsheets, things that were very basic that we could get to them and leave behind. Because I think somebody had brought a laptop with them, because I think Kay spoke Spanish as well, if I'm not mistaken, and she's from Kansas City, just to kind of give you an idea of where people were coming from. But that was one of those kind of pivotal times in the trip where it's like, gosh, you know, we had everything from nurses to IT people in the hopes of creating some type of digital record keeping. Because right now, at that point, everything was done in a folder. And most of the time people were carrying their own folders with them. It's not like they had a medical records office at the hospital. But I'm pretty much in touch with everybody that's still in this picture. One of the beauties that came out of this group, because we had planning retreats before and then we had post retreats after. Well, what wound up happening is for about 7 or 8 years after our original mission, we did reunions. And what wound up happening was we would go to a different state. So we went to Florida, Kansas City, trying to think, Maine, sorry, because that's where Hector was from. And then the group came to Baltimore. But what wound up happening was we would all have these weekend reunions that were service projects. So we did like a Habitat for Humanity's one trip. We did a local gardening community garden, helping them clean that up, things like that. So for the longest time, you know, we would get together and continue that service. The big thing that happened, which has nothing to do with any of this, is Francie, who is right here, if you can see my cursor. Well, come to find out, you know, we knew this. I didn't find this out after the fact. This woman is wealthy, but you would have never have known it. But she wanted to do something to give back. What happened out of this trip, she started her own international medical foundation. And part of this crew continues now to go to Colombia, which is where Gisela is from, and she's in the yellow shirt. They've continued that mission that started with the 14 of us going to Peru. So, you know, how one trip and one experience can really kind of change directions for a lot of people was amazing. Because what I came back with was going, you know, there's more to life than just taking pictures inside a hospital. You know, I went back to school, I got my degree. You know, other people had changed careers, some have retired, you know. So, you know, it's just one of those situations where I'm almost, you know, I applaud you, Jerry, to continue to go on these missions. Part of me doesn't want to go anymore. It has such a huge impact on me. I'm not sure any other trip could live up to the personal experience, much less the photographic experience of what I brought back. And I'm going to actually get out of here for a second. I'm just going to stop the screen share. Everybody still there? There you are. But the other thing that happened was the photos that you saw also were turned into an exhibit. And that exhibit went to 4 states. It went to the hospitals where these people worked. And it developed a whole new sense of communication surrounding this trip, and getting more people engaged into supporting it. Because at that point, it was just a very quiet, kind of private project. You know, little did I know that, you know, taking these photographs would open other eyes and get more people engaged, whether it was through money or time, or even actually physically going on the trip itself. So that is my story. Hopefully you got something out of it. Any questions?
Great story.
Well, Rob, I guess I will leave it with you.
You're on mute.
Yeah, right as I started talking, it muted me. I don't know why. I guess that's about it, everyone. Our next meeting is June 10th, 6:30 p.m. The door will open at 6. That'll be Lynn doing advanced image composition. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a great night.
You too.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks and goodbye.
Bye.
Night.